Good afternoon, Detective O'Hara, and thank you for joining us again.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation.
No problem. So we're here again to discuss human trafficking, and I'm glad that you have lent your expertise to us today. So we can get started just by you telling us a little about yourself before we start talking about the questions.
Sure, no problem. As you said in your introduction, I'm Detective O'Hara, Liam O'Hara. I am with the NYPD's Human Trafficking Squad, which is part of the larger Vice Human Trafficking Unit. And as the name would suggest, we concentrate on sex trafficking and labor trafficking.
Okay, so can you just give us a brief description? What is human trafficking?
So in the simplest possible terms, trafficking is basically the exploitation of vulnerable people for financial gain through fraud, coercion, or force. Most people, when they think of trafficking, they think of sex trafficking, although they usually tend to think of what they've seen in television and movies, which is kind of not, the best representation of what it actually is in this country and around the world. And sex trafficking is, of course, it's the manipulation, the exploitation of people, like I said, vulnerable people, where they are, made to have sex for money, without their own compensation. So there's a broader debate going on right now as to whether or not prostitution or sex work is a viable means of economic empowerment. That's a completely different conversation. But if someone is made to have sex through force, fraud, or coercion, an adult, without receiving compensation in exchange for having sex, that's sex trafficking. Anytime a child, or an adolescent has sex for money, that is also sex trafficking. And then labor trafficking is, it could be in any industry. And it's, basically when people are working and not being paid, and they are working, again, being exploited through force, fraud, or coercion.
Okay, thank you. So you said a little about the victims of human trafficking. They can be adolescents, they can be adults. Can they also be males?
Oh, yes. I have had cases with men who are, 60 years old, 50, 60 years old. That would be a labor trafficking case that I'm referencing. But it could be any demographic. That's important to keep in mind: man, woman, or child, any race, any demographic, educated, housing secure or insecure. But it's also important to note that, generally speaking, trafficking typically touches the most vulnerable in our society. So while it can be anyone, it typically would be people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, immigrants, people of color, LGBT community. Those would be the people that I typically see most in my investigations.
Okay, so can you tell us about one of your most impactful cases that you've had? I know that you can't share details or names with us, where you were able to stop traffic.
Yes, my partner and I, and like you pointed out, and I'm glad you did that, we can't discuss specifics of ongoing cases, but my partner and I conducted a long-term investigation wherein the perpetrator specifically was recorded, and he was basically proud to say that he was manipulating young women of color from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds because it was so easy to do. And he did not fall into that category himself. So, he was bragging almost that it was easy to do. And it just kind of, he summed it up perfectly, although he didn't know he was doing it for us at the time. But he summed it up perfectly. That's the mindset there. And it felt good to be able to put a stop to it.
Were these young women that were underage, or were
They were
underage?
Yeah.
Okay. So we've noticed that trafficking is something that it's on a rise in the Bronx. So can you tell us about some of the most prevalent areas where you found trafficking?
Do you mean like the neighborhoods?
Yes, the neighborhoods.
Yeah, well, as you could imagine, given what we've already discussed, unfortunately, the Bronx has a lot of neighborhoods that have been for many decades underrepresented and underserved, and lacking in resources. Unfortunately, we just had that tragic fire up in the Bronx, which obviously has nothing to do with trafficking, but it just kind of underscores, the very difficult conditions that a lot of people in the Bronx unfortunately have to live with. And the same kind of, broadly speaking, the same kind of conditions that allow a fire like that, a tragic fire like that in the 21st century to claim so many lives. It's the same kind of malaise. It's the same kind of underlying conditions that make it the Bronx a target-rich environment for sex trafficking or labor trafficking as well. But when you have a community or communities where you have people who are immigrants and vulnerable in that way because of maybe their status, their documentation status, or you just have, American citizens that are living in very difficult conditions, you have this allure of fast, easy money. At least that's how it's marketed to them. And unfortunately, they find out all too late that it's the opposite of easy. But it's any neighborhood really. I don't want to name specific neighborhoods, but you could imagine any neighborhood that you go in, and you've got people that are living, paycheck to paycheck, or people that are on public assistance, and there's buildings with no heat in them, or no plumbing, or that kind of situation. No working plumbing. The conditions where someone can exploit that population, because especially young people, those people, the predators, the traffickers, they see that, and they see the desperation, and that is what they tap into. And so that's why I bring up the fire. Any neighborhood where you see a building in such disrepair, and people that are just living in such difficult conditions, it's the same exact neighborhood where these kinds of traffickers thrive, unfortunately.
So what can we teach our children, or adults for that matter, about trafficking and how to protect themselves against traffickers?
Yeah, well, it's multifaceted. A big thing now is social media. So to always be vigilant, if you have access to the internet and you are on social media, always be vigilant, because it's very easy. It's a process that we call grooming. It used to have to take place in person, but now it could take place from far away, on the internet, where you can have someone on the other side of the United States, being groomed by somebody here in New York. And I have seen this happen, where they will they think that they're engaging in some sort of long distance kind of romance. And there might even be kind of a mix of there's romance plus we can make some money together. You know, New York is the land of opportunity. There's lots of money to be made here, the big city, big lights. And these people hop on a bus or whatever the case may be, and they wind up in New York, and then it's a completely different kind of reality. That could also go the other way, you know, people from New York, but obviously my jurisdiction is here. So I see people coming here. Always be wary on the internet. If you've got a complete stranger showering you with praise, completely almost out of nowhere, especially if you're a young person, and then they're promising you the world, be wary of that. You know, nothing good in life comes easy. And if somebody's promising you riches and love and attention, I would be very, very wary of that. And parents should be wary of who their kids are speaking to on the internet. And then, you know, that's on the internet, but it's also happening the good old fashioned way. I've had multiple cases where traffickers are standing outside of schools or standing in or sitting in a McDonald's near a school where he knows that the kids come in on their lunch break, and they'll offer to buy him a free meal, or, you know, they might have some weed, marijuana that they offer, you know, so like a little bit of a party, a free meal, why don't you come hang out with me? You know, just it's know who your friends are, your family. And if you feel like, and this is mostly for young people, if you feel like there is someone that's potentially targeting you or friends or family, reach out to someone in the school or reach out to the police, because we care. And, you know, never be afraid to, you know, if you see something, say something. Never be afraid to point out someone or something suspicious. I've had a lot of cases start that way, where a young person with a good head on their shoulders say, look, there's this guy hanging out at McDonald's every day, and he's offering to buy me and my girlfriend's lunch, but he's like, you know, a way older guy, and he's just hanging there all day, and it's weird. And then, you know, we'll look into it. We will go out and look into it, and we always appreciate, you know, that information from people. And just another message I'd like to put out there is for people that are immigrants. Here in New York City, law enforcement agencies, the NYPD, my team, we do not inquire about documentation status. The only time that we care about your status here as an immigrant is if we can see if we can help you get a visa. You know, if you've been the victim of a crime, if you're the victim of trafficking, we can try to get you what we call a T visa. So that's the only time we care about your status, is if there's something we can do to help. But never be afraid, because immigrant populations are always extremely vulnerable to this kind of threat. And so, you know, I want the service providers out there, the nonprofit groups, the you know, the law firms and the lawyers that specifically deal with immigration, you know, concerns, the advocacy people out there. I want them and the immigrant community to know that we're here to help, and we see you, and we know that you are, you know, you're here, you're working New Yorkers, you have a family just like everybody else, and you know, we know that you guys are vulnerable to exploitation, and don't ever be afraid to reach out to us. You know,
Is there a hotline that they can call?
Sure. There's the, I don't have the numbers in front of me, although I can get them to you so that when this video is posted later, we can have that available. But there's, you know, Crime Stoppers, there's the National Human Trafficking Hotline, there's, you can just call regular 911.
Okay.
Also, some of the best cases that I have had, that I've done, some of the most success is that brave people, immigrants specifically, you know, who knew that they were being exploited and weren't afraid to report it, would go to a law firm or an advocacy group or a nonprofit that works in their community, and then that group or those people would reach out to us, and we'd all sit down at a table together. And, you know, it's only with that kind of collaboration and communication and cooperation that we can do successful cases.
Okay.
We're a citywide unit, but the city is, you know, there are many, many different neighborhoods and ethnicities and, you know, groups in this city that, you know, sometimes maybe, you know, to get better access and understanding to that community, a group that works in it every single day, all day, every day, we need their help. And so, you know, they will act as like a bridge between us, because sometimes people, and understandably so, people are wary of law enforcement or, you know, intimidated by law enforcement. We say it till we're blue in the face that you've nothing to fear from us, but sometimes it needs those, you know, we need those arbiters to kind of bridge the gap and get us, you know, in a place of trust with that community.
So that's really good advice to go to an advocate in your community or an attorney that can then bridge that gap to go to NYPD to help them get out of that situation.
Or any district attorney's offices.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because sometimes, you know, these, you know, legal groups will kind of sometimes, I think, feel more comfortable attorney to attorney.
Mm-hmm.
And I have had these groups reach out to a district attorney, and they'll have a meeting, they'll have a talk, and then they'll reach out to us to do the work. And it's beautiful when everybody comes together for a good cause.
Absolutely. So what is the best way if I suspect someone is being trafficked, what's the best way that we can help that person? I know that you just said that we can take them to an advocate, take them to an attorney, call 911. What do you think the best way would be?
Well, that also depends on who the person is to you.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's a family member or a friend, and it could be, everybody thinks, you know, that trafficking is something that happens elsewhere, not in my community, not to my family, not to me. That's sometimes the most difficult aspect, is people are being trafficked and they don't know that they're being trafficked. Someone can be working in an otherwise legal industry, let's say construction or the restaurant industry, and their employer could be their sponsor. Let's say if they're an immigrant, right? It don't have to be an immigrant, but their employer says, you do X, Y, and Z work, and I'm not going to pay you, but I'll help you with A, B, and C later on down the road. And that just never happens.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that would be like the fraud facet of trafficking, not force or coercion, but it's a fraudulent aspect to it. So that person is doing this work, maybe, especially if they're an immigrant, not familiar with how things are done in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And they're working ostensibly for free. They're not receiving compensation. And, you know, it's that promise of help, that vague promise of help that will come later, and it never quite does. You know, my mother, I'm first generation. My mother is an immigrant, right? So, you know, I understand, and I was born here in New York City. So, you know, I understand it could be anyone. It could be your own spouse, family, friends, right? If that person is from another country and you feel like maybe the situation that they're in is exploitative, then, you know, you can have a chat with that person, talk to them about what's going on, and then maybe see if they would be willing to come in to any of those, you know, groups that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So that's if you know the person, if you have some sort of a relationship, just communication. You know, like I mentioned earlier, with young people, with kids, being aware of where they are, who they're friends with, who they're talking to on the internet, right? And so, like, again, it can't possibly be my kids, right? You know, I'm a good parent, but it's just not possible, especially if you work like most of us do. It's just not possible to be with them all the time, right?
Mhm.
So if your kid's spending a lot of time behind closed doors on the internet, and then there's maybe gaps of time where we're not 100% sure, are they with their friends? I don't quite know. Or did they have practice after school today? I can't remember. Or are they actually going to practice after school? Are they actually going to school, right?
Mhm.
If if there seems to be like some sort of a lack of communication, if you don't have 100% understanding of who your kid is with all the time and their movements and who they're communicating with online, right? That's one red flag. It doesn't have to be trafficking. It could be some other sort of situation that might not be healthy. But specifically with regards to trafficking, if your own family, child, friends are, for example, it's a kid, 14 years old, doesn't have a job, but is coming into school, right? If you're in education, is coming
Mhm.
into school with designer goods, expensive clothing and accessories. And you say to yourself, she's 13 years old, or he is 13 years old. He doesn't have a job. And I know mom and dad are hardworking people, but that's a $1,000 handbag. That doesn't sit right. If you have a relationship with that person, maybe try to talk to them, right? But even if you can't really get through to that person, again, that's something that you can report to us. And then, if it's just a total stranger, but for whatever reason you think that there might be trafficking, labor, or sex going on there,
Mhm.
and it's uncomfortable or would be possibly strange or even dangerous for you to approach that person, um, it, it that's something that you can just anonymously report even to us, and just the more information the better. But
Mhm.
that's another thing I didn't mention earlier, is that all of these things can be reported anonymously, and oftentimes they are. So it calls to mind that if you see something, say something campaign for
Mhm.
the back in the day with the subways.
Yeah.
um, don't ever feel, New Yorkers, we rely on our intuition. We know our communities, we know our city. If you see something that strikes you as not right, if you see, kids on a subway platform that are way inappropriately young, selling candy, right? 5-year-old kids alone, going from subway to cars, subway car, selling candy, right? That's probably not a good situation. But maybe you're not sure of yourself and you don't want to personally get involved. You can anonymously report that to any of those resources I mentioned as well. So there's a
Wow.
lot of ways that you can get involved.
Okay. So I want to thank you again for taking your time out and having this discussion with us. I know that this is a battle that is going to be probably till the end of time, trying to stop traffic,
Yeah.
especially in a city like New York City. So I thank you and the officers of the NYPD, who are so vigilant out there trying to stop this horrific practice in our city and protecting our citizens. So I appreciate you taking the time out again.
Well, thank you as always for the interest in this extremely important subject, and thank you for the invitation to speak. And I hope the message gets out there, because without groups and organizations like your own, the message wouldn't get out there. And so, I'm really glad to help.
Thank you. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.
Thank you. You too.